They said Duke Cedric Blackthorne had not smiled in 11 years, not since the fire took half his face and all of his mercy. They said the last man who crossed him still flinched at the sound of carriage wheels on gravel. They said his estate swallowed brides whole. So when the Ashcroft girl stepped down from her carriage into the frozen dark of Blackthorne Manor, every soul watching held their breath, not for her sake, but for the sheer spectacle of innocence walking straight into the mouth of something older, colder, and far less forgiving than anyone had warned her. What happened next, nobody predicted. Nobody. Soy asamita. The morning Vivian Ashcroft learned she was to be married, her mother was eating toast, not weeping, not wringing her hands in the dramatic fashion that Lady Ashcroft usually reserved for social catastrophes. A misaddressed invitation, a gown arriving in the wrong shade of ivory, the particular tragedy of being seated too far from the hostess at a winter supper. No. Margaret Ashcroft sat at the long breakfast table in their townhouse on Grosvenor Square, silver knife moving across the bread with calm, mechanical precision, and announced it between sips of tea the way one might mention a change in weather. "You are to be married to Duke Blackthorne. The arrangement has been signed." Vivian had been standing in the doorway with her sketchbook tucked under one arm, still wearing her morning wrap, hair barely pinned. She was 19 years old and had been awake for exactly 12 minutes. The sketchbook hit the floor. Her mother did not look up. "Pick that up, please. We don't drop things." The silence that followed was a living thing. It pressed against Vivian's sternum, cold and specific, the kind of silence that arrives when a person's entire concept of their future collapses inward like a structure whose foundation was never real to begin with. She had known, in the abstract way that all girls of her class knew, that her marriage would be arranged, negotiated, decided, in rooms she would never enter by men who would never ask. She had known the way one knows that winter comes, distantly, theoretically, with the comfortable buffer of not yet. But Blackthorne, even the name carried weight. She had heard it in drawing rooms, whispered behind fans and over card tables, carried in the nervous laughter of women who were grateful, genuinely grateful, that their daughters were not in the running. Duke Cedric Blackthorne of Northumberland. 36 years old, never remarried after the death of his first betrothed, though the circumstances of that were always discussed in the vague, evasive language people use when they suspect something dark but can't prove it. The scars on his face. The years of isolation at that estate no one visited voluntarily. The cold, absolutely impenetrable stillness he carried through the rare social appearances he made, like a man who had decided that the performance of warmth was beneath him and simply stopped pretending. Vivienne picked up her sketchbook. "When?" she said. 6 weeks. The Duke has agreed to allow you time to prepare a trousseau. He was quite specific that he requires nothing elaborate." Her mother finally looked up, and there was something in her expression that Vivian could not quite name. Not cruelty, not indifference, but the flattened, pragmatic resignation of a woman who had made a calculation and arrived at an answer she could live with. "Your father's debts, Vivian. You understand." She understood. She had understood for 2 years, since the whispers started at the edges of parties, since the invitations slowed, since she noticed that her younger sister's new dresses stopped arriving and nobody mentioned it. She understood the arithmetic of their situation with the sharp, weary clarity of someone who had been quietly doing the sums in her head for a long time and hoping the numbers would change. They hadn't. "He is not a cruel man," her mother said, which was precisely what a person said when they were not certain. "They call him the Beast of Blackthorne. Society calls everyone something ugly when they can't understand them." Her mother set down her teacup with a small, definitive click. "Society is also, by and large, composed of idiots." It was, Vivian had to admit, not the worst thing her mother had ever said. It also did absolutely nothing to make her feel better. The weeks that followed were a particular species of purgatory, not actively terrible, but hollowed out, the way a house feels after furniture has been removed. Life continued around Vivian with its usual texture and noise. Her sister Charlotte chattered about an upcoming musicale. Their father appeared at dinner with the careful, eyes-averted energy of a man who knew he had done something that could not be undone and was hoping that time would smooth it over. Modistes arrived. Trunks were packed. A solicitor came and went. The machinery of transaction moved forward with the polite, unstoppable efficiency of the class that had invented such transactions. Vivian went through the fittings with her arms extended and her eyes fixed on the middle distance, and she thought about what she knew. What she knew was essentially the scaffolding of a nightmare assembled from second-hand accounts. Cedric Blackthorne had inherited the dukedom at 22 after his father's sudden death. He had been, by all early accounts, relatively unremarkable, so not particularly beloved by society, but not despised either. The scars happened when he was 25, in a village fire some 40 miles from the estate, and nobody seemed entirely clear on the details beyond the fact that he had gone in, and people had come out, and afterwards his face looked the way it looked now, and he had stopped coming to London with any regularity. His first intended, a girl named Catherine Fallow, had broken the engagement 3 months after the fire. He had not sought another match. Until now. Until her father's debts had grown too large to manage, and apparently the Duke of Blackthorne had decided, for reasons Vivian could not fathom, that 19-year-old Vivian Ashcroft, with her moderate dowry and her ruined family's name, was the solution to whatever absence he needed to fill. She had tried once, carefully, to ask why he wanted to marry at all. Her mother had looked at her with that same flat, exhausted pragmatism. Men of his title require heirs. It is not a mystery, Vivian. It was not a comfort, either. She spent the last 2 nights before her departure sitting at her desk with her sketchbook open, not drawing, just holding the pencil and staring at the blank white space. Once, she began a sketch of a manor house surrounded by dark trees and stopped herself before it became something she recognized. She wrote a letter to Charlotte that she didn't send, because everything she wanted to say felt too large and too honest, and she didn't want her sister to carry it. On the morning of her departure, standing on the front steps while the footman loaded the last of her trunks, Charlotte grabbed her hand very suddenly and held it with a fierceness that was out of character for a girl who expressed affection mainly through light, glancing comments. "Write to me," Charlotte said. "Every week. I don't care how long. Just write." "I will." "If he's horrible," Charlotte. "I'm serious. If he's horrible, you tell me and I will find a way." "Charlotte." Vivian squeezed her sister's hand once, hard, and let it go. "I will be fine." She did not believe it. She was not certain Charlotte believed it either. But there are things a person says because the alternative, standing on a step in the early morning cold and screaming the truth at the sky, accomplishes nothing. The carriage rolled forward. Vivian did not look back. But it was a 9-hour journey north, growing colder with every mile in the way that northern England always grew colder, as though the land itself was issuing a warning. The light changed first, the bright winter sun of London giving way to something lower and more reluctant, pressing against the horizon rather than rising above it. Then the landscape. The neat geometry of the south dissolving into something rougher, broader, less managed. Fields gave way to moorland. Villages became sparse, trees grew larger, older, less ornamental. They lined the roads not decoratively but densely, the way trees grow in places where no one planted them for beauty. Vivian watched it all through the carriage window and felt herself becoming progressively, irreversibly small. She had brought 3 books and opened none of them. She had brought her sketchbook and touched it once and put it down. She sat with her hands folded in her lap and watched the north come toward her. And she thought about courage, specifically about how people spoke of it as though it were a quantity a person either possessed or didn't, when in her experience it was actually more like a candle in wind, not a matter of having it, but of cupping your hands right. She was not brave. She knew this about herself without self-pity, the way one knows their own height. But she was, underneath the fear, grimly determined, and she had found over the years that determination and bravery were not the same animal. Bravery felt good, she imagined. Determination mostly just felt like not stopping. She was not going to stop. The gates of Blackthorne Manor appeared without warning, which was somehow worse than if there had been gradual approach. One moment the road wound through trees, and then there they were. Iron, old iron, not decorative, not announcing wealth, just standing with the absolute authority of something that had stood for a very long time and did not require ornamentation to be taken seriously. The crest above the gate was a blackthorn branch, stripped bare, and Vivian looked at it as the carriage passed beneath and thought that whoever had chosen that particular emblem had at least been honest about what they were. The drive to the house was long, long enough that the anticipation built past anxiety and into something calmer on the other side of it, the kind of stillness that comes when a person runs out of room to dread things and simply arrives. The manor itself materialized out of the dark gradually. It was not the Gothic castle of the stories, not in shape. It was large and old and architecturally without warmth, built in the severe northern style that favored endurance over beauty, stone the color of winter sky. Most of the windows were dark. A few were lit, amber against the gray, and Vivian fixed her eyes on those lights because they meant people, meant warmth, meant the merely uncomfortable as opposed to the completely desolate. The carriage stopped. A footman appeared, opened the door, handed her down. The cold hit her immediately. Not London cold, not the social cold of drafty ballrooms, but the deep, old, unapologetic cold of the North, the kind that settles into wool and doesn't leave. She stood on the gravel drive and looked up at Blackthorn Manor and breathed carefully, in and out. Then the front door opened. The man who appeared at the top of the steps was not what the stories had built. This was the thing that would stay with Vivian afterward, in the weeks and months to come. The detail that returned to her in quiet moments with an insistence that felt like correction. He was not what the stories had built. The stories had built something monstrous, a figure grown in the telling until it was more symbol than person. The scarred duke, the beast, the cold nobleman who terrified servants and sent society women running for their smelling salts. She had been preparing herself for months for a monster, and what descended those front steps was merely a man. A severe one, a hard one, but a man. He was tall, genuinely tall, not the politely inflated height of drawing room descriptions, but the kind of height that changes how a person occupies a space, that makes them visible in rooms full of people, not because they seek to be seen, but because their physical presence simply will not be ignored. He wore no overcoat despite the cold, dark jacket and dark waistcoat, with the absolute lack of ornament that spoke either of asceticism or complete indifference to impression. His hair was dark, carrying the first threads of gray at the temples that one saw in men who had arrived at 36 through difficult terrain rather than easy passage. He moved down the steps the way he wore his clothes, without performance, without the social calibration that most people engaged in automatically when approaching a stranger. Then she saw his face. The right side was, she supposed, what he had looked like before. Strong-boned, long in the jaw, with eyes set deep under a brow that suggested default severity rather than active displeasure. A face built for gravitas, not warmth, but not unkind in its architecture. The left side carried the fire's work, scar tissue running from jaw to temple, pulling the skin in a way that was not grotesque but was undeniable. The permanent record of something that had happened and could not be undone. It had the quality of a landscape altered by weather. Not ruined exactly, but irrevocably changed. His eyes were gray. Not metaphorically gray. Not the romantic silver gray of novels. Just gray. The color of the sky behind him, of the stone of his house, of the north itself. And they were fixed on her with an attention so complete and so absolutely devoid of social posturing that it was, in its own way, more alarming than any unkindness could have been. He was simply looking at her, taking her measure, not performing judgment, not performing welcome, so just looking the way a person looks who has stopped caring what their expression communicates. He stopped 3 feet from her. "Lady Vivian," he said. His voice was low and level, with the faint northern edge that long years hadn't entirely smoothed out. "Your Grace," she said, and was grateful, with distant clinical gratitude, that her voice came out steady. They looked at each other across those 3 feet, and the entire weight of an arranged marriage, and 11 years of solitude, and 6 weeks of mounting dread. A gust of wind moved across the drive, stirring her skirts, doing nothing whatsoever to him. "You're cold," he said. "It's—" "Yes." The journey was long. "Come inside." He turned without waiting for her response, which she would have found rude if it had been accompanied by any social heat, any dismissiveness or contempt. It wasn't. It was simply the action of a man who assumed he would be followed, not because he was performing authority, but because he had issued an instruction that was in her immediate interest and he saw no reason she would refuse it. She followed him. The inside of Blackthorn Manor smelled of wood smoke and old stone, and something underneath that she couldn't name. The accumulated smell of a house that had been lived in for centuries by people who were mostly gone now. It was not unwelcoming, it was simply old. The entrance hall was large and high-ceilinged and lit by candles and iron fixtures that matched the gates, functional and severe, casting warm light that softened the stone walls. A wide staircase rose to a landing above. A fire burned in the stone hearth at the far end, and Vivian moved toward it with a gratitude that bypassed all social consideration. The Duke said to no one she could immediately see, "Mrs. Pelham." A woman appeared from a side door, 50s, compact, with the particular quality of long-service staff who have become genuinely necessary rather than merely employed. She had a quick, assessing gaze that moved over Vivian in 2 seconds flat and arrived at a conclusion that looked, tentatively, like approval. "Your Grace." She dipped in a brief, efficient curtsy. Then to Vivian, "My lady, I'm Mrs. Pelham, the housekeeper. Welcome to Blackthorn Manor. We've prepared the East Wing rooms for you. There's a hot supper waiting, and your trunks will be brought up. Thomas will show your lady's maid to her room when she's come inside." "Thank you," Vivian said, and meant it with a depth that surprised her. "The rooms will suit," the Duke said. It was not a question. Mrs. Pelham looked at him for one small, compressed moment. "Yes, Your Grace." Something passed between them. Not conflict, but a kind of language that required context Vivian didn't have. Then Mrs. Pelham was gesturing her toward the staircase, and she went, and she was aware of the Duke's gaze on her back until she turned at the landing and he was gone from her sightline. The room was not what she expected. She had been bracing, without fully admitting it, for something cold and deliberately inhospitable. A statement of her status in this arrangement. A room that said guest rather than wife, practical rather than anything approaching welcoming. What she found instead was large and warm, a fire already established in the grate, the furniture heavy and old but well-maintained, the bed dressed in dark wool with the addition of a quilted coverlet that someone had recently placed on top. Fresh flowers on the dressing table, winter flowers, bare and architectural, not decorative in any conventional sense, but someone had gone to the effort of placing them. Mrs. Pelham showed her the dressing room, the connecting door to a small sitting room beyond, the view from the windows which in darkness was simply black. She explained the household schedule, where to find things, which bell to ring, with the brisk efficiency of someone who understood that practicality was its own kind of kindness. Then she said at the door, "His Grace asks that you join him in the library when you're refreshed, at your convenience. There is no urgency." "Of course," Vivian said. After Mrs. Pelham left, she stood alone in the middle of the room and listened to the silence. It was a different silence from the one in the carriage. Not the silence of dread filling a space, but the silence of a very large, very old house doing what old houses do. Settling. Breathing. The fire popped. Wind moved at the windows. She became aware that she had been holding tension in her shoulders since approximately 6 o'clock in the morning, and that the fire was warm and the room was not hostile, and she was, in this particular moment, physically safe. She sat on the edge of the bed and put her face in her hands and breathed. Not weeping. She was not a crier, a fact about herself she'd established early and accepted. Just breathing, allowing the day to move through her and out, the way you drain standing water because she was going to need whatever room she had in her chest for what came next. After several minutes, she got up, washed her face and hands in the basin that had been prepared, changed from her travel dress with her lady's maid Ruth's quiet assistance, and ate the supper that arrived. A beef broth, bread, cold roasted chicken that was better than anything she'd expected in a house that had reportedly been running on minimal staff for the better part of a decade. Then she stood at the window for a moment, looking at the darkness that was Northumberland, and she thought, "All right, you are here. Now find out who you're dealing with." She went to find the library. What? It took her 2 wrong turns and 1 helpful footman to locate it, which told her something about the size of the house. The door was heavy oak, slightly ajar, light seeping through the gap, and she could hear very faintly the sound of papers being moved. She knocked. "Come in," the Duke said. He was at the desk when she entered, a massive thing in the center of a room that was, she realized with a start, nothing like the rest of the house. Where the rest of Blackthorn Manor was severe and functional, the library was simply enormous and full. Floor to ceiling, every available wall surface covered in shelves, and the shelves full of books that looked used, not displayed. A fire burned here too, larger than the one in her room, and the lamps were lit with a generosity that said this was a room someone actually lived in. The desk was covered in papers and maps, and what appeared to be ledgers. He had removed his jacket and was in his waistcoat and shirt sleeves, and he was writing when she entered and finished the sentence before he looked up. He did not stand. She would learn later that this was not rudeness, or rather, that for Cedric Blackthorne the conventions of social performance had been stripped away so completely over the years of isolation that he had lost not the impulse to be decent, but the instinct to perform decency in the specific way that society required. He did not stand because he did not in the moment think about it. He looked up and he looked at her with that same complete, unguarded attention, and he said, "Sit down." She sat in the chair across the desk. The silence stretched out for several seconds. In a drawing room, this would have been unbearable. Here, surrounded by the smell of books and wood smoke, it was merely a pause. He looked at her. "Are you afraid of me?" he said. She could have lied. She almost did. Had the polished social reflex engaged, the easy denial that would have been gracious and manageable. But there was something about the directness of the question, about the way he asked it with the same flat, unsentimental register he seemed to apply to everything, that made the lie feel not just dishonest but actively silly. "Yes," she said. "A little." He nodded once, as if this were a reasonable accounting and he had expected it. "Good," he said, and she stiffened, and he added, without visible awareness that this required clarification, "Better than pretending. Pretense wastes time." She studied him. He had picked up his pen again, not dismissively, but with the air of someone who holds a tool out of habit rather than intent. "May I ask you something?" she said. "You'll ask it regardless," he said, which was so bluntly, accurately true that she almost smiled. "Why me?" He looked up again. The gray eyes moved across her face, and she had the distinct, disorienting sensation of being read. Not appraised, not assessed for social value, but read, the way you read a text you're trying to understand. "Your family's situation is known," he said. "Your father's debts required a solution. I required a wife." "That's the transaction," she said. "I understand the transaction. I'm asking why me specifically." A pause. Something shifted in his expression. Not warmth, not softening, but a kind of fractional adjustment, the way a door moves when the wind changes on the other side of it. "I was given several options," he said. "I observed them at various social functions over the past year. Most of them were—" He stopped. The pause had the quality of someone editing themselves, choosing precise language over instinctive language. "Performing," he said finally. "They were performing what they thought I required." And I wasn't. "You were drawing," he said, "at the Pemberton dinner in February. You were seated in the correct place at the correct table, and you had your sketchbook in your lap under the cloth, and you were drawing the centerpiece, and you were doing it with the expression of someone who would rather be absolutely anywhere else but was making the best of it." She stared at him. She remembered the Pemberton dinner. She remembered her mother's sharp look when she'd noticed the sketchbook, the muttered correction. She had not been aware that anyone else noticed. "You didn't come to speak to me," she said. "No," he said. "So you watched me at a dinner party for 2 hours and decided to end my freedom," she said, and the bluntness of it was out before the social override kicked in, and she waited for his reaction with something cold moving through her chest. He looked at her for a long moment. "Yes," he said. The word landed. She let it land. The fire crackled. "That is—" She stopped. Started again. "I understand necessity. I understand what my father's situation required. But I was—" She stopped again, because there was a version of what she wanted to say that was honest and a version that was composed, and neither of them was quite the same as what she felt, which was the specific, particular grief of being a person whose course was altered by forces completely external to any choice she made. "I had plans," she said. "Small ones. I understand they don't matter in the ledger of all this, but I had them." The silence after this was different, not the silence of a man formulating a dismissal, something heavier. "What plans?" he said. It was not quite a question. She looked at him. Does it matter? I asked, he said. She studied the fire for a moment. I wanted to illustrate books, scientific illustration, natural history. I'm good at it. I was trying to arrange introductions to publishers. She heard how small this sounded in a library that could have swallowed most publishers whole, in a house that could have contained a dozen of her father's townhouse. There was a botanist in Edinburgh who was interested in correspondence. I had been developing a portfolio. The Duke was quiet for long enough that she thought he wasn't going to respond. Show me, he said. What? The work. Show me. I don't have anything prepared to. Not tonight, he said. He picked up the pen fully this time, which she understood to mean that the present portion of the conversation was resolved in his mind, and began writing again. Show me when you're settled. She sat there for another moment, genuinely uncertain what to do with this. Is that all? She asked. One more thing, he said, still writing. Your rooms in the East Wing are yours. Your time is yours. I will not require your company at meals unless you wish to give it. I will not enter your rooms without your permission. I will not. He paused, and the pause was so deliberate, so precisely weighted, that she understood he had thought about what he was about to say, that it was not improvised. I will not ask more from this arrangement than you are willing to give freely. He looked up. Do you understand what I mean? She held his gaze. Her heart was doing something complicated. I understand, she said. He nodded, looked back down. She stood, and she was at the door when he said, without looking up, The botanist in Edinburgh. His name. She blinked, turned back. Dr. Alistair Gove, why? I know of him, the Duke said, in the tone of a man noting a fact rather than offering anything. She waited to see if there was more. There wasn't. She left. But she lay awake for a long time in the large east wing bed with the quilted coverlet pulled up and the fire burning low, and the darkness of the Northumberland countryside pressing against the windows, which did not, as she had feared, feel like a coffin. It felt like a country, large and cold and requiring navigation. He was not what she had expected. This was the problem. The fear she had carried for 6 weeks had been built on a specific architecture. Cruelty, intimidation, the deliberate small violences of a man who owned a situation and intended to use it. She had been preparing herself for that, had been building internal resources against it the way one waterproofs a coat. But you cannot waterproof against ambiguity. You cannot prepare for a man who looks at you like a text he wants to understand, who says, I will not ask more than you are willing to give freely, in the tone of a man reporting weather conditions, who somehow knew about the Edinburgh botanist and noted it with the calm specificity of someone who had done, at some point and for some reason, considerably more investigation than a man merely selecting a wife ought to have done. Why, she thought, not for the first time? Why this arrangement? Why now? What does a man like that actually want? The fire shifted. Somewhere in the house, something creaked. Old stone, old timber, the organic conversation of a structure that had stood through things she couldn't imagine. She thought about what Mrs. Pelham's expression had contained during that small compressed pause in the entrance hall. She thought about the flowers on her dressing table, who had put them there, and why, in a house that had no women in it, and therefore no social necessity for the gesture. She thought about the scar, and what she knew about how it had happened, and how little of that story seemed to match the man who had looked up from his desk with gray eyes and asked her, without performance or cruelty, whether she was afraid. Better than pretending, he had said. Pretense wastes time. For a man who had reportedly spent 11 years disappearing from the world, he had offered her the truth of the arrangement with a directness that left no room for comfort, but also no room for false hope, which was, she was beginning to think, possibly its own kind of respect. She was not certain. She was not certain of much. She was in a strange house in the north with a man she did not know, and the life she had been quietly planning in the margins of her actual life had been redirected, and grief was a word that felt too large and too theatrical for what she felt, which was more precisely the quiet closing of a door. But the flowers. Someone had put winter flowers on the dressing table of a room that had likely been unoccupied for years. Someone had ensured the fire was already lit before she arrived, that the coverlet was added over the standard linens, that the supper was better than it needed to be. She thought about what it meant for a man to do those things, while also being the kind of man who asked, "Are you afraid of me?" with the flat, undefended honesty of someone who already knew the answer and simply preferred it stated. She didn't resolve it. She wasn't going to resolve it tonight. She closed her eyes and listened to the house breathe, and told herself that she was not in a story she didn't know the ending to. She was simply at the beginning of one. And beginnings, by definition, were not endings. She slept. Checked. The first week passed in careful distance. Vivian learned the rhythms of Blackthorn Manor the way one learns a new city, by moving through it, making wrong turns, finding the places that felt like themselves. The house was larger than it appeared from the drive. Not sprawling, but deep. The kind of architectural accumulation that happens when a structure has been added to over centuries by people with different priorities and different aesthetics, resulting in passages that went somewhere unexpected and rooms that opened onto other rooms in combinations that required rethinking. She mapped it in her head the way she mapped things, through detail and relationship rather than linear progression. Within 4 days, she knew where the kitchen garden was, which rooms the morning light entered, where the back stairs that the servants used emerged onto the first-floor corridor, and which door in the library led to a small attached room lined with geological survey maps that appeared to be in active, recent use. She did not see the Duke except at dinner, which they took together 3 times in that first week, at a table that was built for 12 and set, with a practicality that struck her as either considerate or quietly absurd, at one end only, so that they sat across from each other at a reasonable conversation distance, rather than shouting down polished mahogany. He spoke little. She spoke little. But when she mentioned once that she had found the geological survey room and asked about it, he answered with a completeness and precision that suggested the topic was one of actual interest to him. He had been surveying portions of the estate for drainage purposes, had been working with an engineer from Newcastle. The existing drainage in the North Field was original to a period of construction that predated any rational approach to the problem. He talked about drainage systems for 11 minutes. She timed it internally, not to count it, but because she was trying to understand what the information meant, that there existed topics on which Cedric Blackthorn would simply speak, would lose the careful economy of his usual communication, and those topics appeared to be ones where the interest was genuine rather than performed. She asked 2 follow-up questions. He answered them both. When the topic was exhausted, he went quiet again, and they finished the meal in silence. And it was not precisely companionable, but it was not unbearable, and that struck her as more significant than it probably should have. On the 5th day, she found him in the stable yard. She had gone out in the early afternoon for the purpose of getting cold air, which she had found was a requirement for her mental architecture. She needed to be outside once a day, or something inside her began to compact. The estate grounds were large enough to walk and varied enough to sustain interest, and she had been working her way through them systematically, which was how she came around the corner of the stone wall that separated the kitchen garden from the stable yard. At the same moment that the Duke emerged from the stable in his shirt sleeves with a bucket of something, saw her, and stopped. Neither of them spoke for a moment. He was, she observed, in the middle of doing something physical and entirely at ease in the doing of it, which was at odds with every social iteration of the Duke she had observed in the house. The estate coat, the unremarkable working clothes. He looked, in this context, like a man who belonged to the land rather than above it. "I didn't know you rode," she said, because the silence needed breaking, and this was what she had. "I don't," he said. "This one's lame. I'm checking the leg." "Oh." She looked at the stable door. "May I see?" He looked at her with that reading expression. "Do you know horses?" he asked. "I grew up with horses," she said. "Less than you have, I imagine. But I'm not useless." He moved aside from the stable door. She took this as invitation, which it was, and went in. The horse was a gray, large, beautiful, currently standing with its left foreleg elevated and an expression of dignified martyrdom. Vivian crouched beside the leg and ran her hands along it with the careful attention of someone who had spent a reasonable amount of her childhood in the company of horses and their discomforts, and she found the swelling above the fetlock and said so, and he crouched beside her, very close, she registered, without making anything of it. And they spent 10 minutes examining a horse's leg together in the dim, warm-smelling interior of the stable, and it was the least socially governed interaction she had had in 6 years. When they stood, he looked at her with a different quality in the gray eyes. Not warmly, exactly, but like something had been confirmed. "You're not what I expected," he said. "I've been thinking the same," she said. The corner of his mouth moved. Not a smile. Not that. Not yet. But something that was in the family of smiles the way that a sketch is in the family of a painting. An acknowledgement of the possibility. She thought about it afterward, walking back through the kitchen garden. She thought about what it meant that Cedric Blackthorne, who had been described as cold and unfeeling and removed from everything gentle in the world, had taken a lame horse out of rotation and was treating it himself rather than delegating, had gotten onto the stable floor in his good clothes to check the leg with the attention of someone who actually cared what he found. She filed it beside the flowers on the dressing table and the geological surveys and the 11 minutes about drainage and the absolute directness of, "I will not ask more than you are willing to give freely," and she began to understand that she was building a picture of someone. Not a monster, not the social construction, but an actual person, complex and damaged and private in ways that went considerably deeper than mere reticence. She was not falling for him. She was nowhere near it. She barely knew him, and what she knew was austere and difficult, and shot through with silences that she did not yet have the language to interpret. But she realized with something that was almost alarm, genuinely curious. It was on the 9th day that she heard him. She had woken before dawn for no particular reason, some interior alarm that served no obvious purpose, and had lain in the dark for an hour before giving up and lighting a candle and finding the nearest of the 3 books she had brought and actually settling into it this time. The house was quiet the way it was only in those dead hours before anything stirs. She read for perhaps 40 minutes, and then she heard it. From the floor below, muffled by stone and distance but unmistakable, the sound of something crashing, followed by a silence that was different from the house's ordinary silence. Not alarmed, curious, she put on her wrap and took her candle and went down the back stairs she had located on day 3. The library door was open. He was standing with his back to her, one hand braced on the mantel, the other hanging at his side. On the floor beside the desk, a glass had fallen. She could see the spill, dark, catching the firelight. He did not appear to have heard her. His posture had a quality she had not seen in him during any waking interaction. Not the composed, controlled stillness of the man at dinner or at his desk, but something rougher and less managed. The posture of a person who was alone and had stopped holding the shape. She should have gone back upstairs. She knew this. She said quietly, "Your Grace." He turned immediately, and she saw his face, saw what was in it for the one unguarded moment before the control came down like a shutter, and what was in it was pain, old and specific, and entirely at odds with the gray-eyed deliberateness she had been cataloging. Raw in a way that transformed the severe, scarred face into something entirely human and entirely undefended for the 2 seconds it took him to reassemble. "You're awake," he said. His voice was controlled. "I heard something fall." She looked at the glass, looked back at him. "Are you injured?" "No." "You're certain?" "I knocked it with my arm. It's nothing." He looked at the glass and she saw him make a decision. Not about the glass, she thought, but about something larger. He turned away from the mantel and moved to his desk and sat down with the deliberate, effortful quality of a man sitting down through choice rather than ease, reclaiming authority over his own posture. "Go back to bed," he said. "It's nothing." It was not nothing. It was clearly not nothing, and they both knew it. And Vivian stood in the doorway with her candle and the particular dilemma of someone who had been offered a polite lie and was trying to decide whether to accept it. She accepted it. "Good night," she said. "Good night," he said. She went back up the back stairs and stood in the corridor outside her room for a long moment in the dark, and she thought about the face she had seen in that 2-second window. The thing behind the composure, the rawness of it, the specific quality of pain that was old rather than fresh, the kind that had been lived with for so long it had become structural rather than occasional. Something had happened tonight. Something had reached through whatever system he used to manage himself and gotten to him, gotten through. Not his face, not his reputation, but the actual interior of the man, whatever was underneath the 11 years of deliberate removal from the world. She stood in the corridor and she thought about a 25-year-old man running into a burning building for strangers, and what you do with yourself after, and what it costs to maintain a distance from everything for long enough that the distance stops being strategy and becomes habit. She did not know what had happened in the library tonight. She did not know what the specific trigger was, what anniversary or correspondence or memory had pulled the structure loose enough that a glass fell in the small hours. But she thought, for the first time, with something sharper than curiosity, with something that had an edge to it. She thought, I am going to find out. She went back to bed. She did not sleep. The letter arrived on the 14th day of her residence at Blackthorn Manor, brought on a silver tray with the rest of the morning correspondence. And it would not have been notable except that Mrs. Pelham's face, when Vivian came down for breakfast and found the tray in the entrance hall and saw the Duke already holding it open, standing completely still in the gray morning light. Mrs. Pelham's face was doing something very carefully controlled and very subtly frightened. The Duke read the letter once. He folded it with the same precision he applied to every physical action, and he set it on the tray. He did not say anything. He looked up and saw Vivian at the bottom of the staircase, and for one extraordinary moment she was certain he had forgotten she was there. Not forgotten in a dismissive way, but genuinely, as if the letter had taken him somewhere far enough from the present room that her presence registered as unexpected. His expression closed. "Breakfast is prepared," he said, and walked past her toward the dining room. She looked at Mrs. Pelham, who was looking at the letter on the tray with the expression of a woman who had seen correspondence arrive at this house before with the power to do damage. The housekeeper looked up, met Vivian's eyes, and said nothing. But the nothing said something. Vivian ate breakfast across from the Duke's silence, which was a different silence than any she had catalogued in the previous 2 weeks. His food was nearly untouched. He was present at the table the way a coat on a chair is present, the shape without the person inside it. She watched him and thought about the letter and thought about who might write to Cedric Blackthorn, isolated at his northern estate, with the power to take him somewhere she couldn't follow. It was not until later, walking in the kitchen garden, that she heard it. One of the stable lads talking to a groom, low voices carrying in the cold air farther than intended. "Cousin's coming. Thomas heard it from Cook, who heard Mrs. P. on the telephone last night." Blackthorn's cousin? The one who— "Aye. Reginald." A pause. God help us all then. She stood very still in the kitchen garden with her sketchbook open to a blank page and a pencil in her hand. Reginald. She did not know the name. Not yet. But the stable lad's voice had carried a specific quality. Not simple gossip fear, not the social nervousness of staff anticipating a demanding guest. Something older and more genuine. The kind of unease that came from experience. The pencil moved without her fully directing it, working out some restless interior process on the page. She looked down and saw she had drawn, without intending to, the outline of a figure in a doorway. Dark shape, no face, the framing of the door making it ambiguous whether the figure was entering or leaving. She closed the sketchbook. Reginald Blackthorn was coming to the manor. And whatever he was, whatever role he played in the architecture of the Duke's careful, walled-off existence, the servants were afraid of it, and the Duke's face had gone somewhere unreachable, and the letter was still sitting on the silver tray in the entrance hall, folded with precise control. A small and ordinary rectangle that Vivian could feel, even from the kitchen garden, radiating something cold and intentional in her direction. She had told herself, on the night of her arrival, that she was simply at the beginning of a story she didn't yet know. That beginnings were not endings. She had not accounted for the possibility that someone else had already written the ending they intended in advance without her knowledge, and was already on their way. The name sat in Vivian's chest for the rest of that morning with the specific weight of something she didn't yet have the context to interpret but couldn't set down. Reginald. The stable lad had said it the way people say the name of a storm, not with the shapeless dread of the unknown, but with the precise, particular dread of something experienced before and survived, and not wanting to survive again. She went back inside. She did not mention what she'd heard. The Duke spent the day in his study with the door closed, which was not unprecedented. He spent portions of most days behind that door. But today it had a different quality, a density of silence rather than the ordinary quiet of a man at work. Mrs. Pelham moved through the house with increased efficiency, which Vivian had already learned to read as the housekeeper's version of agitation. The faster she moved, the more she was managing. At dinner, the Duke ate. He answered the two questions Vivian put to him about the Northfield drainage with adequate precision. He did not raise his eyes to hers more than twice. She watched the line of his jaw and thought about walls, how the same architecture that kept things out also kept things in, and what it cost, over years, to maintain that structure from the inside. She didn't push. She was learning that with Cedric Blackthorne, pushing accomplished exactly nothing. He was not a man who yielded to pressure. He was a man who simply became more stone. Reginald Blackthorne arrived 2 days later, mid-afternoon, in a carriage that announced itself by being louder and more ornamental than anything Blackthorne Manor routinely received. Lacquered black with a crest on the door that was the Blackthorne branch but modified, gilt-edged, performed rather than worn. Vivian saw it from the window of the small sitting room adjoining her bedroom, where she had been doing preliminary sketches for the botanical work she had finally, tentatively, begun allowing herself to resume. She set down the pencil. The man who stepped out of the carriage was younger than she had expected, perhaps 28, 29, and built on a narrower frame than Cedric, with a handsomeness that was the social kind, the kind that was assembled and maintained rather than simply present. He wore his coat like he'd considered it. He looked up at the facade of the manor with an expression she couldn't fully read from above, but which had in it something that was not quite admiration and not quite contempt, and was possibly both operating simultaneously. Then he looked up farther, and his eyes found her window with a speed that suggested either coincidence or the practiced awareness of someone accustomed to surveillance, and he smiled. She stepped back from the glass. Her heart was doing something she didn't appreciate. Not fear exactly, the simple mechanical increase of a body encountering something it categorizes, correctly or not, as a threat. She stood in the middle of the sitting room and breathed once, deliberately, and thought, look at the information, not the feeling, the information. The information was, a man had arrived whose name frightened servants, whose coming had pulled the Duke into a closed room for a full day, and who had, upon stepping out of a carriage, located her at a third-floor window in approximately 4 seconds, and smiled at her as though they already had an understanding. That was, by any reasonable measure, a significant quantity of information. She picked up her pencil and went back to the botanical sketch, but her hand wasn't steady, and the line she drew was wrong, and she set it down again. Passette. They met formally at supper, which Mrs. Pelham had expanded to 3 settings with the expression of a woman performing a duty she found distasteful. Reginald Blackthorne stood when Vivian entered the dining room and bowed over her hand with a precision of courtesy that was technically flawless, and somehow, in its flawlessness, communicated exactly nothing genuine. "Lady Vivian," he said, "I've been wanting to meet you since the announcement. You're—" He paused, with the timing of someone who has rehearsed the pause. "Not what I imagined." "People rarely are," she said. He smiled. The smile was good. It reached his eyes, which was the thing about it. Most performed smiles didn't bother. His did, which made it more difficult to locate the insincerity she was certain was present rather than less. Cedric, at the head of the table, had not stood. He was watching his cousin with the gray eyes giving away precisely nothing, and there was between the two men a current that Vivian could feel the way you feel a current in water before you're in it. The pressure differential of attention long established and carefully maintained. "Cousin," Reginald said, settling into his chair with the ease of a man entirely comfortable in a room that wasn't his. "The North is treating you as austerely as ever, I see." "It suits me," Cedric said. "Yes, it would." Reginald reached for his wine with no particular hurry. "London's been speculating about your new bride. You'll be pleased to know the general consensus has shifted from pity to curiosity." "I won't be pleased to know anything about London's consensus." "No, you never were?" He looked at Vivian. "He was always like this, even as a boy." "Did he tell you that?" "Our families summered together for 3 years. He was perfectly capable of spending an entire week in the same house without speaking to anyone unless directly addressed." "That sounds efficient," Vivian said. Reginald's smile shifted slightly. "Defending him already. How loyal." "Observing accurately," she said. "It's a different thing." The dining room was quiet for a moment. Cedric's eyes moved to her with something in them she hadn't seen before, that, not gratitude, that was too warm a word for the register he operated in, but a fractional attention of a different quality, the way a person looks at a situation that has just altered from what they expected. Reginald refilled his wine. The dinner proceeded. She heard them afterward. She had not intended to. She had gone to the library for a book and was already on the second-floor landing, heading back to her rooms, when the voices reached her from the study below. Not the library, the study, the door imperfectly closed, sound traveling up the stairwell with the peculiar acoustics of old stone. She stopped. She knew she should move. She stood exactly where she was. "Not asking you to like it, Cedric. I'm asking you to be reasonable. You're asking me to review the Eastern land accounts with you present." Cedric's voice, lower, carrying a flatness that was different from his ordinary economy. "The same accounts you've been managing at my discretion for 3 years. The answer is no." That's a pause. A sound like a glass being set down harder than necessary. That's insulting. It's a decision. You brought a wife into this house, into this family. Don't you think that changes the conversation about the estate's future management? No? Cedric? Reginald. The single word flat and final as a door closing. Silence. Then Reginald's voice again altered, the performed warmth entirely gone, something underneath it that was cooler and more precise. "You've always done this. Closed everything off, managed everything alone, pushed everyone out. I've watched you do it for 11 years and I've stayed anyway because I'm family. Because what happened to you was..." "Don't," Cedric said. Very quiet. Quieter than the flat voice, which was what made it dangerous. "Don't reference what happened. Someone needs to. Not you, not ever you." The silence after this one had a different texture entirely. Not the silence of a pause, but the silence of a line crossed, of something said that could not be unsaid, a space where something used to be before it was burned through. Vivian moved away from the landing, carefully, without sound. She went back to her rooms and sat at her dressing table and looked at her own face in the mirror and thought about what she'd just heard. Not the surface, not the specific disagreement about land accounts, though she filed that away with the precise attention of someone who understood that information about money was never only about money. The thing underneath. The way Reginald had said what happened to you and Cedric had said not ever you with the contained absolute quality of someone defending a wound so specific and so old that the defense had become automatic, performed in the dark, when no one was watching, with the same precision as in daylight. Whatever the fire had been, whatever had happened at 25, Reginald Blackthorne had a relationship to it that the Duke found intolerable. She thought about that for a long time. 3 days of it. That was what the visit accumulated into. 3 days of Reginald moving through Blackthorne Manor with his practiced ease and his performed warmth, speaking to the servants with a friendliness that was thorough enough to be systematic, joining Vivian for morning walks in the grounds, twice when she hadn't specifically invited him, asking questions about her family and her background and her interests that were, individually, perfectly ordinary and collectively felt like the careful construction of a profile. He was never overtly inappropriate. He was never unkind. He was, in fact, consistently charming. The social kind of charm, the assembled kind, the kind that Vivian had grown up around and could recognize by the gap between its surface texture and whatever was operating below it. On the 3rd afternoon, she was in the kitchen garden with her sketchbook, and he found her there. "The botanist at work," he said, settling onto the bench at the garden's edge with the familiarity of someone who had done so many times. "Sketching," she said. "It's different." "Is it?" He looked at her work, a study of bare branch structure, winter architecture of a hawthorn at the garden's east wall. "You're talented. Has Cedric seen these?" "Some." "What did he say?" "He said he wanted to see more." She kept her pencil moving. "He's a man of minimal commentary." "He is." Reginald was quiet for a moment. The quiet had the patient quality of someone waiting for a space to place something. "He wasn't always. As a boy, he was... You'd be surprised, actually. He talked. He laughed. Before." He stopped. She looked up. His face, for once, had lost the polish. What was underneath was harder to read precisely because it was less constructed. Something that could have been genuine grief or could have been its precise imitation, and she could not determine which. "Before the fire," she said. "Yes." He met her eyes. You know what it did to him, beyond the obvious. I know what people say about it. People say very little about it because Cedric made sure of that. He closed down every avenue of conversation about it within a year. He leaned forward slightly. Did you know I was there? At the village. I was 20 years old and I was there when it started. She stilled. I tried to stop him, Reginald said. I grabbed his arm when he went for the door and he shook me off like I was nothing. He went in 3 times. The second time the roof section came down. He was looking at the bare hawthorn, not at her. I stood outside and watched. That is what I did. The kitchen garden held its silence. Why are you telling me this? She said. He looked at her then, and the expression was complex enough to be real, and that was what frightened her about it. Because you're trying to understand him. I can see it. And I want... He stopped, corrected. Someone in this house should understand him completely, including what he's like when he believes he's been abandoned. The word abandoned sat in the air between them like a coal, still shaped but altered at the core. What does he do? She said carefully. He calcifies, Reginald said. He becomes more himself, more stone. Until eventually there's nothing left that can be reached. He stood, smoothing his coat with that habitual attention to presentation. I'm not his enemy, Lady Vivian. Whatever he's told you, whatever he's implied, I've been the only family willing to remain in contact for 11 years. That counts for something. He walked back toward the house. She sat in the kitchen garden and turned her pencil over in her fingers and thought about the information, not the feeling, the information, and tried to determine what precisely she'd just been handed and why, and what she was expected to do with it. Reginald left the following morning. The house exhaled. She found Cedric in the stable yard again, same gray horse, different problem. A loose shoe this time, and he was crouched with the leg between his knees in the way of a man who had done this before, not performing competence, but simply doing the thing. She said nothing for a moment, just stood in the yard with the cold on her face, watching. He told me he was at the fire, she said. His hands did not stop. The shoe, the examination, his hands kept moving through it with the same unhurried precision. I know he told you, Cedric said. You knew he would. I suspected. He set the horse's leg down, straightened. He was looking at the horse's shoulder rather than at her. What else? He said he tried to stop you from going in. He did. He said he stood outside and watched. He did. She waited. The horse stood with its resigned dignity. The cold pressed down on the yard with the weight of December doing its serious work. He said you calcify when you think you've been abandoned, she said. Now he looked at her. The gray eyes had the particular quality she'd been trying to identify since the night in the library. Not emptiness, which was what people described who saw only the surface. The opposite of emptiness. A fullness that had nowhere to go, a pressure without outlet, the look of someone who had been holding something for so long that holding had become the only available action. He's not wrong, Cedric said. I know, she said. I've watched you do it. Something crossed his face, rapid, involuntary, gone before she could categorize it. He turned back to the horse. He wants the Eastern land accounts reviewed, she said. I heard you refuse him. A pause. You were on the landing. Imperfectly closed door, she said, without apology. He was quiet long enough that she thought he wasn't going to respond. Then, the Eastern land yields have been managed under my general authority for 3 years. The numbers don't correspond to what they should. He said this in the flat, reporting tone, as though summarizing a document. I've been reviewing the discrepancy for 6 months. She absorbed this. You think he's been taking from the accounts? He said nothing. Cedric. First time she had used only his name. It landed between them with a weight she hadn't fully anticipated. His back was to her, and she watched the line of his shoulders and thought about what it cost, what it specifically cost, to be a man who discovered that the only family who stayed was possibly staying with their hand in the accounts. The compounded cruelty of it, the almost structural neatness of the wound. I don't think, he said finally. I know. She stood in the cold yard and let that settle, and she thought about Reginald's careful, thorough tour of the manor's social landscape, the servants, the grounds, her background, her loyalty. And she thought about the information she'd just been given in the kitchen garden, the precise calibration of it, what it was designed to make her feel, and toward what action. She thought about walls and what it cost to maintain them, and she thought about a 28-year-old man with a polished smile and a genuine-seeming grief story that had arrived at exactly the right moment, in exactly the right register to soften a new wife who was still learning the architecture of her husband's silences. "He was building something with me," she said. "This week." Cedric turned to face her fully. His expression had the quality of someone encountering a thing they expected but hoped wouldn't materialize. "Yes," he said. "What does he want me to do?" The gray eyes held hers. "Doubt me," he said simply. The yard was very quiet. The horse shifted. Somewhere in the distance, a crow moved across the white sky with the unhurried purpose of a bird that owned everything it surveyed. Vivian looked at Cedric Blackthorne, the scars, the severe face, the controlled stillness of a man who had removed himself from the world so thoroughly that the world had simply confirmed his absence and moved on. And she made a decision that was not, she was aware, entirely rational. It was faster than rational. It was the kind of decision that happened below the level of argument, in the body's faster intelligence, the part that reads a room before the mind has finished composing its assessment. "Then he's failed," she said. Something in his face moved. Not the corner of the mouth possibility she'd seen before. Something more fundamental and more frightened. Because she was beginning to understand that hope, for Cedric Blackthorne, was not experienced as warmth, but as exposure. As the sudden vulnerability of a structure that has been sealed for so long, it no longer knows how to be open. He looked at her for 3 long seconds. Then he said, "Don't be certain too quickly." "I'm not certain of anything," she said, "except that a man who puts flowers on a dressing table and treats a lame horse himself, and talks about drainage systems for 11 minutes because it's the only topic that makes him forget to be defended. That man is not what his cousin wants me to think he is." The silence after this was the longest yet. "The flowers," he said, and stopped. "Who put them there?" He looked away. "I told Mrs. Pelham." He stopped again, started differently. "They were there when my mother was alive. She kept winter flowers in all the guest rooms. I didn't see a reason to." He stopped a third time, and this stopping had a different quality from the others. The quality of a man who has walked into a sentence and found it contains more of himself than he intended to expose. Vivian said nothing. She let the stopped sentence stand. He looked back at her. "You should know," he said carefully, "that Reginald doesn't make mistakes. What he builds towards something. If he was constructing something with you this week, it isn't finished." The gray eyes were direct, carrying the flat urgency of someone stating a fact they would prefer not to have to state. "Whatever he told you about the fire, about standing outside, he told you because he knew you'd tell me. He wanted me to know he'd told you." She absorbed this. "Why?" "Because now I've confirmed the accounts," he said. "And now you know I've confirmed them. And now—" He stopped, his jaw set. The look in his eyes was not fear. Fear was not in the operational vocabulary of Cedric Blackthorne. She was beginning to understand. But there was something adjacent to it, something that was the higher stakes version of fear, the version that wasn't about your own safety. He was looking at her. He was looking at her, and the thing in his eyes was not fear for himself. She understood this the way you understand something when your body knows before your mind does. Fast, cold, landing in the chest with the weight of its own significance. "He's going to use me," she said. Cedric said nothing. "Against you," she said. The crow crossed the white sky again, or a different crow, and the cold pressed down on the yard, and Cedric Blackthorne looked at his new wife of 14 days with the expression of a man who has spent 11 years constructing a life that could not be reached, and has just watched someone walk through the wall he forgot to finish. "I don't know yet what form it will take," he said, which was the most honest thing he had said to her, and possibly the most honest thing he had said to anyone in a very long time. She stood in the yard and held this, held the shape of it, the specific, irreversible quality of a situation that had just become something other than what it was. She had arrived at Blackthorne Manor as a transaction, a necessity, a girl delivered north to solve an arithmetic problem. She had spent 2 weeks carefully, analytically mapping the distance between the story she'd been told and the man who existed inside it. She had not expected to be moved to the center of someone else's war. She had not expected to find, standing in the cold of a stable yard, that she already cared enough about the outcome to be frightened by it. Cedric turned back to the horse. His hands resumed their work. Careful, sure, the hands of a man who fixed what was in front of him because that was what could be done. She watched his back and thought about Reginald's departing carriage, and the polished smile, and the genuine seeming grief, and the question she could not yet answer, which was, what was coming next, and how far in advance had he already planned it? She did not know. But somewhere south of Blackthorn Manor, on a road that was carrying him back toward London and its drawing rooms and its strategic conversations, Reginald Blackthorn was already writing the next chapter, and her name was in it. She could feel it with the certainty of someone who has just realized they have been in a story longer than they knew. Not at the beginning, not at the transaction, not at the carriage arriving through iron gates, but earlier, at a dinner party in February, when a girl drew a centerpiece in her lap, and a man across the room noticed and decided, and the machinery of it started moving before she ever had a name for what she was walking toward. The gray horse stamped once. Steam rose from its breath in the cold air. Vivienne picked up her sketchbook. She went inside. She did not run. The letters started arriving 3 weeks after Reginald left. Not to Cedric, to London. Vivienne didn't know this at first. She knew only what she could observe directly. The way Mrs. Pelham began intercepting the morning post before it reached the entrance hall tray. The way 2 of the younger housemaids had started watching her with a specific, uncomfortable quality that she recognized after 2 days as the look of people who had been told something and were waiting to see if it was true. She knew that Cedric had begun spending longer hours in the study with the door fully closed now, not imperfectly, and that when they took dinner together, his silences had acquired a new texture. Not the ordinary economy of a man who did not perform warmth, but the compressed, deliberate silence of a man managing something he had not yet decided to share. She let it build for 5 days before she asked. She found him in the library at 9 in the evening, which had become, without either of them formally deciding it, something close to a ritual. The library at 9, the fire, whatever proximity passed between 2 people who were learning each other in the measured, careful way of people who understood that speed was a luxury neither of them could afford. She had come to value these hours in a way she hadn't anticipated and didn't entirely know what to do with. She sat in the chair across the desk. She looked at him. "Tell me what's happening," she said. He didn't look up from the document he was reading. "Nothing that requires your concern." "That's not what I asked." Now he looked up. The gray eyes moved across her face with that reading quality, assessing not her appearance but her state, where she was, what she could handle, what he was willing to give. "Reginald has been corresponding with Lord Ashworth," he said, "and with 3 other members of the Northern Landowners Association. I have been made aware of the content." Lord Ashworth. She knew the name, a man of significant regional influence, the kind of man whose opinion moved the social and economic architecture of the North the way weather moved crops. "What content?" she said. Cedric set the document down. His hands remained flat on the desk, a deliberate stillness. "He has suggested to them that my marriage was conducted in irregular circumstances, that your father's situation made your consent uncertain, and that my management of the Eastern land accounts has resulted in losses that I have been concealing." He stated this the way he stated everything, flat, complete, without the armor of emotional register. "He has suggested I am not of sound judgment." The room was very quiet. "He's filing for guardianship review," she said. Not a question. "Not yet. He's building the ground for it." He paused. "If he can establish that I am mismanaging the estate and that my judgment is compromised, by isolation, by the circumstances of our marriage, by the account discrepancies he himself created, he can petition the courts for oversight of the dukedom. Given that I have no heir and he is next in the direct line." He stopped. She heard what he hadn't said. "He takes everything," she said. "He takes control of everything, which is the same thing." She sat with this, turning it over, examining its architecture the way she examined difficult compositions, not looking for beauty but for structure, for the underlying logic of how the thing was built. Reginald had spent 3 years creating discrepancies in the Eastern accounts. He had maintained the relationship with his isolated, difficult cousin, Because the relationship was the cover. He had arrived at Blackthorn Manor the moment a wife appeared, not because the wife changed the inheritance mathematics, but because a wife was a new variable, and new variables were either tools or obstacles, and he had spent 3 days determining which she would be. He had decided she was a tool before he arrived. The kitchen garden conversation. The precise calibrated disclosure about the fire. I stood outside and watched, deployed to generate in her both sympathy for Reginald and the specific corrosive variety of doubt about a man she barely knew. The question, what does he do when he believes he's been abandoned, was not a question about Cedric's psychology. It was a preparation. It was Reginald pre-constructing the emotional context in which later she would receive whatever accusation he intended to make and feel the pull of already established doubt. She felt something cold move through her that was not fear, but was adjacent to it. The cold of understanding a plan in full retrograde, seeing all the pieces from the position of having already been moved by them. He thought I'd help him, she said, or at minimum that I wouldn't actively work against him. Yes. He misjudged. He's not accustomed to being misjudged, Cedric said. It will make him move faster. She looked at him. What do we do? The pronoun landed in the space between them, and she watched him register it. Watched something in the flat, controlled face respond to we with the fractional, involuntary quality of a man encountering something he had stopped expecting. He covered it immediately, the shutter coming down with the practiced speed of long habit. But she had seen it. I'm compiling the full account records, he said. 6 months of documentation. I have a solicitor in Newcastle who is trustworthy. That's defense, she said. What's the offense? He looked at her with something that was almost, not quite, but almost, the corner of the mouth thing she'd seen before. You've been in this house for 3 weeks, he said. I'm a fast study, she said. What's the offense? She didn't sleep well that night. She lay in the east wing bed and stared at the canopy and thought about the specific mechanics of what Reginald had built. The slow, patient construction of it, the years of it, the way he had maintained the appearance of the only loyal family member while methodically creating the conditions for extraction. She thought about what it cost to do that. Not the calculation of it. The calculation was cold and clear, and she understood cold and clear, but the sustained quality of it, the years of performances at this very table, in this very house, looking at a scarred and isolated man and thinking, eventually. She thought about Cedric at 25, running into fire, and at 26, learning that the woman who was supposed to marry him couldn't bear the face he'd brought back, and at 27, beginning the withdrawal from the world that had become, over the subsequent decade, something so total it had nearly erased him from the social map entirely. She thought about what Reginald had called calcification and what she now understood it to actually be. Not coldness, not emotional limitation, but the specific structural adaptation of a person who has learned repeatedly and thoroughly that trust is an architecture that collapses. You stop building the thing that keeps collapsing. This is not a character flaw. This is engineering. She understood it because she recognized it, distantly, in a smaller version of herself. The girl who had gone through trousseau fittings with her arms extended and her eyes fixed on the middle distance because full presence in unbearable situations was a luxury that cost more than it was worth. The difference was a degree, and the company one was forced to keep while surviving. At 2 a.m, she got up, put on her wrap, and went downstairs. Not the library this time. The study. She knocked. A pause. Then, "Come in." He was at the desk, which did not surprise her. The account ledgers were spread before him in the organized grid of a man doing forensic work, comparing columns, noting discrepancies, building the documented case with the same methodical attention he gave to everything practical. He looked up. He did not ask why she was there at 2 a.m, which was one of the things she was beginning to actively appreciate about Cedric Blackthorn. He rarely asked questions whose answers were self-evident. "The letters to Ashworth," she said, sitting across from him without invitation. "Did Reginald copy anyone in London?" "2 people that I know of." "Who?" He told her. She recognized one of the names, a woman in Mayfair, a significant social node, the kind of person through whom information moved from rumor to established fact with the velocity of something that had been carefully accelerated. She thought about what it meant for that particular woman to be in receipt of letters from Reginald Blackthorne questioning the circumstances of Lady Vivian Ashcroft's marriage. "My family," she said. "Your father will hear it within the week," Cedric said, "if he hasn't already." She absorbed this. Her father, whose debts had created this arrangement, who had looked at her departure with eyes averted guilt. Her father receiving correspondence implying that the arrangement he'd made for her was legally and morally irregular. She thought about what that would do to a man already compromised, already defensive, already desperate for a version of events in which he had not fundamentally failed his daughter. Reginald had thought of that too. Of course he had. "He's trying to fracture it from both ends," she said. "Isolate you from the regional landowners and isolate me from any support in London." "Yes. So that when he makes his formal move, we're already—" She stopped. "Alone," Cedric said. One word, and he said it with a flatness so complete it took her a moment to understand that this was not analysis, but memory. This was a man stating a condition he had inhabited before, stating it with the recognition of someone who knows the territory of a particular darkness because they have lived in it for a long time. She looked at him across the desk, and the ledgers, and the accumulated careful documentation of a betrayal he had known was coming for 6 months, and had said nothing about because what? Because he had calculated that telling her would frighten her off. Because he had determined that a woman delivered north by necessity would not choose, freely, to stand in the path of something like Reginald if she had any option to step aside. Because he had not believed, until the stable yard, that we was a word available to him. "You should have told me sooner," she said. His jaw moved. "You'd been in this house for 2 weeks." "I'd been deciding about this house for 2 weeks," she said. "There's a difference." The fire shifted. He looked at her with the gray eyes carrying that pressure again, the fullness without outlet, the thing she still didn't have the right word for. She thought she might be getting closer to it. "The accounts," she said. "How complete is your documentation?" "Complete enough for Newcastle, not complete enough for a formal hearing in London." "What's missing?" 3 months of Eastern field receipts that Reginald removed during his visit. His voice on the last words had an edge that was the closest thing to anger she had heard from him. Not hot, not performed, but the cold, specific edge of someone stating an outrage they have compressed into fact. "He came here to take what would expose him. He was in this house for 3 days, and I was—" He stopped. "I was watching you watch him." She held his gaze. "That's what he counted on," she said. "Yes. He used me to distract you. He used the fact that I was—" He stopped again, and this stopping was different from all the others. Was the stopping of a man who has run into the end of what he's willing to say, who has reached the border of a territory he does not have language for or does not trust language to handle without damage. He looked down at the ledgers. She did not push him past it. She filed it carefully in the place where she kept the flowers and the drainage systems and the 11 minutes and the "I will not ask more than you are willing to give freely," and she thought that this border, this particular stopping, was one she would return to, but not tonight. "The receipts he took," she said. "Are there copies anywhere? Secondary records, estate correspondence, supplier invoices, anything that would reconstruct the 3 months?" He looked up. "The suppliers," he said, and stopped. And she watched the calculation move through his face with the speed of a man who was very good at this kind of problem when he wasn't standing too close to it. "Hartley's in Hexham. They've been supplying the Eastern field operations since my father's time. They would have their own records. Can you get them?" "Within a week, if Hartley cooperates." "Will he?" "He has no reason not to," Cedric said. "He doesn't know what they're needed for." She nodded once, stood. "Then do it this week, before Reginald's next move." She looked at him across the desk. "What does your solicitor in Newcastle need from us?" "Us." She watched it land again, watched him absorb it again, the way you watch something enter a material it isn't accustomed to, the slight, involuntary resistance before accommodation. "A formal statement of the account discrepancies with supporting documentation," he said, and he paused. "A statement from you about the nature of your consent to the marriage." The room was very quiet. "He's already said it was coerced," she said. "He's implied it. He hasn't said it formally. But he will." Cedric said nothing, which was yes. She stood at the edge of the desk and thought about what it meant, what it specifically, practically meant. For Reginald to formally allege that Lady Vivian Ashcroft had been coerced into marriage by a financially and psychologically compromised duke. She thought about her father receiving that letter. She thought about her mother, who had announced the arrangement over toast with flat, pragmatic resignation. The same mother who had said he is not a cruel man with the particular intonation of a woman who was not certain. She thought about Charlotte, who had gripped her hand on the front steps and said, "If he's horrible, tell me." She thought about the entire social architecture of what Reginald was constructing, and she saw it completely. Not as threat, but as design. And the design was elegant in the cold, functionless way that traps are elegant. And she was in it, and Cedric was in it. And the question was not how to escape it, because you did not escape the kind of trap that had been built over years by someone who thought 5 moves ahead. The question was what you were willing to break in order to walk out the other side. "He's going to make a formal move soon," she said, "before your documentation is complete. He'll know you're building it." "Yes." "He'll move while the ground is still his." "That would be my calculation." She looked at him. The scars, the gray eyes, the controlled stillness of a man who had been alone in this house for years running toward exactly this convergence and had known it was coming and had found, in the last 3 weeks, something he hadn't expected to find, which was, she thought, the most dangerous thing that could have happened to him, because it was the thing Reginald would use. "He's going to use me against you," she said again, "at the ball." He stilled. The Ashworth Winter Ball. 3 weeks away. The single social event of the northern season to which Cedric Blackthorne had been, she had gathered from Mrs. Pelham's careful mentions, invited as a matter of form rather than expectation for the last several years. The invitation extended, the attendance not anticipated. This year Lord Ashworth had sent a personal note with the invitation, which Cedric had shown her without comment, and which she had read with the understanding that a personal note from Ashworth was not social warmth, but political positioning. Ashworth wanted to see the Duke and the new wife in the room before he decided which side of Reginald's narrative to place his weight on. Reginald would be there. She had known this in the peripheral way she'd been knowing things about Reginald. Not consciously, but in the body's faster processing. The part that had been tracking the shape of things since the kitchen garden. She had known it and had not let herself look at it directly, because looking at it directly meant accepting that the Ashworth ball was not a social occasion. It was the arena. "He'll do it publicly," Cedric said. His voice had gone to a place she hadn't heard before. Lower, more deliberate, carrying the specific quality of a man stating a thing he has been holding in abeyance because naming it makes it real. "He'll do it in front of Ashworth and whoever else he's brought into the narrative. Public accusation is harder to answer than private correspondence. In a room full of witnesses who already have his version," he stopped. "You walk away," she said. "What?" "That's what he's counting on. That's the design. He makes the accusation publicly. Something about me, something constructed, something with enough surface plausibility that in the moment, in the room, with everyone watching, he's counting on you walking away." She looked at him steadily. "Because that's what you do. That's the pattern. That's what he told me in the kitchen garden when he told me you calcify. He was telling me what he was going to do to you." The silence after this was absolute. Cedric's face had gone somewhere she had never seen it go. Not the controlled stillness, not the compressed management, but something stripped of all of that. Something underneath. The face of a man standing at the center of a recognition that was both completely surprising and the most obvious thing in the world. The face of someone understanding a map they've been living inside. "He told you," Cedric said. Very quiet. "Because he knew you'd tell me." "Yes." "And knowing it won't stop the reflex," she said. "That's what he's counting on. That knowing the trap is there doesn't mean you don't fall in." She held his gaze. "He's known you since you were a boy. He knows exactly how much public humiliation in front of witnesses you can sustain before you close." Her voice was even, because even was what the moment required, because this was not a moment for anything soft. "He's going to make you choose, in a room full of people who are already primed to believe the worst, between breaking open in public or walking away from the only person who—" She stopped. The fire moved. Something shifted in the room, in the air of it, in the density, the way certain realizations shift the physical weight of the space they occur in. He was looking at her. She had stopped at the edge of something she had not intended to say, had not known she was going to say until she was already inside the sentence and could see where it was going, and the going was a place she had not given herself permission to acknowledge. And she was 19 years old in a strange house 3 weeks into a marriage that had started as arithmetic, and the man across the desk from her was looking at her with gray eyes that had finally, fully, stopped managing. She held the stopped sentence in the silence between them and let it be what it was. Then she said, "He's going to move before we're ready. That means we have to move first." Cedric said, after a long moment, "How?" "You go to the ball," she said. "We go. Together. And before Reginald can build his stage, we give Ashworth something he didn't expect. Which is," she looked at him, "the truth," she said, "all of it. The accounts, the documentation you have, the discrepancies, the 3 years of it. You lay it out for Ashworth before Reginald can control what Ashworth knows. You take away his ground before he gets to stand on it. The documentation isn't complete. What you have is enough to raise sufficient doubt. Enough for Ashworth to want answers from Reginald rather than from you." She paused. "And I can write to my mother, tonight, before the week is out. A letter that reaches London before Reginald's narrative does." He was very still. "Vivian," he said, and the way he said her name, not Lady Vivian, not formal, just her name plainly, with a weight to it that had nothing to do with performance, made something in her chest do the complicated thing again. "If this doesn't work, then it doesn't work," she said, "and we deal with what comes next. But sitting here documenting while he builds the ground under us is not a strategy. It's a surrender in slow motion." He looked at her for a long time. The fire moved. The old house breathed around them. Then he said, "The letter to your mother. What will you tell her?" "The truth," she said, "that I am here by choice, that I am not afraid, and that someone has been lying about this house and the man in it for a very long time." The gray eyes held hers. "You've been here 3 weeks," he said again, quietly. Not argument. Something more like wonder. The specific, disoriented wonder of a man encountering something his entire architecture of expectation had failed to account for. "I know," she said. She stood up from the chair. She looked at him once more. The scars, the controlled face, the gray eyes finally, completely unmanaged in the firelight. And she thought about what Reginald had built over years, and what Cedric had built over years, and what she was building right now, in this room, at 2 a.m, in 3 weeks, which was perhaps the fastest and least rational construction she had ever undertaken. And also, she understood with a clarity that went all the way down, the most true. "Go to sleep," she said. "We'll start in the morning." She turned for the door. Behind her, he said her name again, quietly. "Once." She paused. "The letter," he said. Tell her that I—" He stopped. The pause was the longest she had heard from him. "Tell her that you are not afraid." She turned to look at him. He was not looking at her. He was looking at the ledgers, at the documented evidence of a betrayal years in the making, and his jaw was set and his hands were flat on the desk, and he was holding himself with the compressed, effortful stillness of a man who has run out of wall to put his back against. "I already planned to," she said. She went back to her room. She sat at the writing desk and took out paper and dipped the pen and wrote the date, and then she stopped. She sat in the cold and the dark, and she breathed once, deliberately, and she thought about the ball 3 weeks away, and Reginald in his polished coat with his assembled smile, and whatever he had built in that room in advance of their arrival. The witnesses positioned, the narrative seated, the forged letters or false testimonies or whatever instrument he had prepared, ready to be produced at the moment of maximum exposure. She thought about Cedric in a room full of people already primed to believe the worst. She thought about the reflex he could not fully override regardless of his foreknowledge. The calcification, the closing, the 11 years of practiced distance that had become structural rather than chosen. And she thought about Reginald knowing exactly which pressure to apply to that structure to make it collapse publicly, to make a duke of the realm look broken in front of the men whose opinion governed his world. She thought about what she had said. "We give Ashworth something he didn't expect." She thought about what she hadn't said, which was that even if everything went exactly as planned, even if the letter reached London in time and Hartley's records arrived complete and the documentation held up, and Ashworth chose the truth over Reginald's performance. Even then, Reginald was not the kind of man who accepted defeat. He was the kind of man who cornered, escalated. She didn't know what escalation looked like for Reginald Blackthorne. She was about to find out. She put the pen to paper. "Dear Mother," she wrote, "there are things you need to know before you hear them from elsewhere, and I am going to tell you all of them because the truth is the only instrument we have that he cannot forge." Outside the window, the Northumberland dark pressed against the glass, absolute and old and entirely indifferent to the small, bright, determined light of a girl who had arrived 3 weeks ago as a transaction and had since become something neither of them had planned for. The pen moved. The clock in the hall below struck 3, and somewhere south, in a carriage or a drawing room or a man's carefully curated plans, Reginald Blackthorne was already writing the scene that none of them knew yet. The one that was coming for all of them at the Ashworth Winter Ball, the one he had built the whole structure to arrive at, the one that would leave a duke standing alone in a room full of witnesses with the worst accusation of his life aimed at the only person he had stopped being able to afford to lose. He just didn't know yet that she wasn't going to let him stand there alone. She just didn't know yet what it was going to cost her to prevent it. The letter reached her mother in 4 days. The reply came in 6. Which meant her mother had read it, sat with it for exactly as long as Margaret Ashcroft ever sat with anything, and then written back with the particular velocity of a woman who had spent years navigating the social architecture of people who wanted things from her family and had developed, through necessity, a very precise instrument for identifying which threats were real. Vivian read the reply standing at the window of the East Wing sitting room with the winter light coming in gray and flat behind her, and she read it twice, and then she sat down. Her mother believed her. More than that, her mother had already, before the letter arrived, received 2 social calls that in retrospect had the distinct quality of reconnaissance and had responded to both with the careful, non-committal warmth of a woman who was gathering information rather than giving it. She had written to Charlotte. She had spoken to their father, who had received a letter from Reginald 3 days prior and had been, in her mother's precise phrasing, considerably agitated. And then the last paragraph, which Vivian read a 3rd time with her pulse doing something irregular. "I am sending this by express, and I am telling you only what I can verify. Lord Reginald has been in contact with Lady Forsyth, whose particular talent for distribution requires no elaboration from me. Whatever he intends to present at Ashworth's ball, it has already begun its social life in London. You have perhaps 10 days before it becomes the version people believe simply because they have heard it often enough. Whatever you're going to do it before the ball, not at it. A trap entered knowingly is still a trap." Vivian set the letter down. 10 days. The Ashworth ball was in 11. She went to find Cedric. He was in the study with the Newcastle solicitor, a compact, careful man named Graves, who had arrived 2 days prior and had been working through the ledgers with the focused, expressionless attention of someone who understood that what he was looking at had weight beyond accounting. Vivian knocked, entered without waiting. She had stopped waiting 3 days ago, a small shift that Cedric had registered without comment, and set her mother's letter on the desk in front of him. He read it. His face gave nothing, but his jaw set in the specific way she had learned meant that a calculation was being revised. Graves looked between them with the professional discretion of a man who was being paid to notice things and had decided the number of things he noticed in this room should be billable. "The Hartley records," Vivian said. "Where are we?" "They arrived yesterday," Cedric said. "Graves has been cross-referencing." She looked at Graves. "How complete?" "Complete enough," Graves said carefully, "to establish a pattern of systematic diversion over 31 months. The Eastern Field receipts that were removed from the Manor show against the Hartley originals, a consistent variance that," he paused, with the precision of a man selecting words for their specific weight, "that does not occur naturally in estate accounting." "He was skimming the receipts before logging them," she said. "The documentation supports that conclusion. Can you build a formal submission from what we have?" Graves looked at Cedric, who looked at her, and something passed between all 3 of them. The specific electric recognition of a situation that had just moved from defensive to viable. "In 8 days," Graves said. "It will be tight." "8 days," she said. "The ball is in 11. We need it done before we walk into that room." She looked at Cedric. We need to give it to Ashworth directly before the evening begins. Not in the ballroom, before. Ashworth won't appreciate being handed documentation at a social occasion, Cedric said. Ashworth won't appreciate discovering he's been used as a stage for Reginald's scheme either, she said. Given a choice between mild social discomfort and having been publicly manipulated, most men of his position choose the former. We need him to receive our information first. Everything after that is his choice. Cedric was quiet for a long moment. She watched him work through it, the calculation, the probability, the variables. This was one of the things about him she had come to understand. He was not slow. He was thorough. There was a considerable difference. It requires us to show him the full account of what Reginald has been doing, he said. Yes. He will understand what it means for Reginald. Yes. And he will understand what it means that I didn't move on it earlier. She looked at him directly. Then we explain that too, honestly. That you were building the documentation that you wanted to be certain before you destroyed your cousin's reputation. She paused. That is the truth, isn't it? He held her gaze. Yes. Then tell it, she said. Ashworth is a man of the North. He's seen enough of the other kind to know what the truth sounds like when someone actually tells it. 8 days passed with the compressed intensity of days that carry too much in them. Graves worked. Cedric worked. Vivian wrote 3 more letters. To Charlotte, to 2 women in London whose social positions made them reliable counterweights to Lady Forsyth's distribution network, and she read every reply with the focused attention of someone tracking weather, not for comfort, but for information. The narrative Reginald had seeded was moving, as her mother had warned. She could feel it in the texture of the replies, the careful phrasings, the questions embedded in apparent concern, the specific quality of people who had heard something and were trying to determine, without revealing that they had heard it, whether it was true. She answered everything with plain, specific, unchallengeable fact. She did not defend, she documented. She was her mother's daughter in this, which she had never previously considered an advantage. On the 9th day, she walked into the library and found Cedric standing at the window with his back to her, and she stopped in the doorway because something in his posture was different. Not the compressed management, not the deliberate stillness. Something older. Tell me, she said. He turned. His face had the stripped quality again. The one she'd seen in the library 3 weeks ago, 2 in the morning, the glass on the floor. Underneath the control, underneath the structure. He was my cousin, he said, when I was a boy. He said it the way a person says a fact that used to mean something else. Before the dukedom, before all of it, he used to come to the estate in summers. It wasn't complicated then. She stayed in the doorway. She let him have the space of it. After the fire, he said. After Catherine. When everyone else, he stopped. He stayed. He wrote. He came. He was the only one who... Another stop. His jaw worked. And all of it was... Not all of it, she said. He looked at her. He was a boy who came to the estate in summers, she said. That was real. Whatever he became after, whatever he decided to become, that doesn't reach back and erase the boy. She paused. It just means the man chose to use him. He held her gaze for a long time. You're considerably more rational about this than I am, he said. I'm not the one he stayed for, she said. The silence after this one was different from all the others. Not the silence of things unsaid, but the silence of things settling, finding their level, the way water settles after disruption. She stood in the doorway, and he stood at the window, and between them was the accumulated weight of 6 weeks and 2 people learning each other in the compressed, accelerated way of people who have been handed a situation and are discovering, past the situation, that what's underneath it is worth the handling. He crossed the room. He stopped in front of her with the 3-foot distance he had maintained since the first night, and he looked at her with the gray eyes completely open, not managed, not shuttered, not performing anything. And he said, very quietly, I don't know how to do this. She understood that this was not the accounting scheme, not the ball, not the legal documentation. Neither do I, she said. Exactly. The corner of his mouth moved. The full possibility of it this time, not the sketch, the actual thing. He stopped. almost said something, chose differently. We should review Graves's submission tonight. Yes, she said. We should. She did not move from the doorway. He did not move from in front of her. Vivian, he said. I know, she said. After a moment, he stepped back. She let out a breath she hadn't noticed she was holding. They went to the study and reviewed the submission, and it was complete and sufficient, and the night outside was very cold, and neither of them said what had almost been said in the doorway, but it was in the room with them nonetheless, and it stayed. The Ashworth ball was on a Thursday. They arrived early, which was Vivian's decision and Cedric's acquiescence. She had explained the logic of it once, and he had accepted it without argument, which was how they operated now, a working efficiency that had developed in the pressure of the past 2 weeks, like something tempered. They arrived early because Reginald would arrive at the expected hour, and between their arrival and his, there was a window. Ashworth's estate was the northern version of grand, large, cold-principled, lit for the occasion with more warmth than its architecture usually permitted. The ballroom was not yet full when they arrived, which was the point. Ashworth himself was in the entrance hall with his wife, receiving early guests with the particular attention of a man who had read Graves's preliminary summary 3 days prior, because Vivian had arranged for it to reach him through a channel that was clean, direct, and predated the ball by enough time to be processed rather than reactive. She had not told Cedric how she arranged it. She was aware this was a detail she would need to address at some point. Ashworth looked at Cedric with the measuring assessment of a man recalibrating, and then looked at her with something she recognized as surprised respect, which was the right response to someone who had done exactly what she had done, and he knew it. Your Grace, Ashworth said. Lady Vivian, I'm glad you came early. We wanted a moment, Vivian said, before the evening's business. Ashworth's mouth moved with the compressed quality of a man not permitting himself a smile at a formal occasion. Indeed, the matter you've brought to my attention, he glanced once at the footman at the distance. We will speak privately, after supper. Before, Cedric said. One word, flat, carrying all the weight of a man who had spent weeks building to this conversation and was not prepared to defer it. Ashworth looked at him, looked at the face, the scars, the gray eyes, the absolute unperforming directness, and made a decision that decent men sometimes make when they encounter a person who is simply telling the truth without dressing it. Before, he agreed. The private meeting happened at 8:30 in Ashworth's study, a room that smelled of tobacco and old decisions. Graves's full submission was on the desk between them, and Ashworth read the summary with the focused, total attention of a man who had run estates and managed difficult men for 30 years, and knew what he was looking at. He asked 4 questions. Cedric answered them. Vivian answered the 5th, which was about her. When it was done, Ashworth sat back in his chair and looked at the ceiling for a moment with the expression of a man who has just confirmed a suspicion he would have preferred to be wrong about. He's been building this for how long? Ashworth said. 3 years, at minimum, Cedric said, in the accounts. The social groundwork. Longer. He came to me in September, Ashworth said, expressed concern about your management, concern about the marriage. His eyes moved to Vivian with a directness that was assessing rather than unkind. He was persuasive. He is, Vivian said. He's had years of practice on the person most difficult to persuade. Ashworth looked at Cedric. I am sorry, Ashworth said, and meant it in the plain-spoken, unpretentious way of northern men who said what they meant because performance was for people with nothing real to say. Cedric said nothing, but something in his face moved. He'll make his move tonight, Vivian said. He doesn't know we've spoken to you. He'll expect to find ground that's already his. And I will not be what he expects, Ashworth said. It was not a question. No, she said. You won't. That's all. Reginald arrived at 9, which was exactly the calculated hour of social maximum, the room full enough to be significant, the evening established enough for an event to be witnessed, late enough to be an entrance rather than an arrival. Vivian saw him from across the ballroom before he saw her, and she used the seconds to look at him clearly, without the management of knowing she was being watched. He was composed. Entirely composed, the assembled warmth fully operational, moving through the room with the ease of a man who believed the ground was his because he had prepared it carefully and nobody had disrupted the preparation. He found her across the room. The composure didn't break, but something behind it recalibrated. She saw it in the fractional stillness that moved through him when his eyes found not just her, but the position she occupied, which was beside Cedric, who was standing with the specific quality of a man who had decided to be present rather than managed, and beside Ashworth, who was speaking to Cedric with the attentive regard of a host who has chosen a side. Reginald's eyes moved between the three of them. She watched him understand. Not all of it, not yet, but enough. Enough to know that the ground had shifted under him in the time between his preparation and this moment, and that the woman he had assessed as a tool had been doing something he hadn't accounted for in the weeks since his visit, and that the man he had prepared to isolate was standing in the correct place in the room with the correct person beside him. He crossed toward them. The ballroom continued its noise around them, music, conversation, the assembled performance of the northern season, and none of it touched the specific pressurized silence that assembled between the four of them as Reginald stopped 6 feet away and smiled. "Cousin," he said, "Lady Vivian, you both look—" The smile. "Well." "Reginald," Cedric said. No title, no warmth. The flat, complete, entirely unmanaged voice of a man who had finished performing. Something crossed Reginald's face, gone in an instant. "Lord Ashworth." He turned the smile on the host with the ease of a man redirecting water. "A magnificent evening, as always. I was hoping we might find a moment—" "We have had our moment," Ashworth said. Mild, absolute. The smile stayed on Reginald's face. The eyes behind it went somewhere very cold, very fast. He looked at Vivian. "You've been busy," he said. "I have," she said. "I underestimated you." He said it without the warmth now, without the assembled performance. What was underneath was harder and more honest, and she found, with a steadiness that surprised her, that she preferred it. At least it was real. "I told you that Cedric calcifies when he believes he's been abandoned. I told you specifically so you'd understand the risk you were taking." He looked between them. "And you both—" "What?" "Decided to trust each other anyway." There was something in his voice that was not entirely contempt. "On 3 weeks. On evidence," she said, "accumulated carefully." "Evidence," he repeated. "The accounts, Reginald," Cedric said. Quiet. The quietest she had heard him outside the study at 2 a.m. Something happened in Reginald's face then. Not collapse, not the dramatic unraveling of a man cornered, but something more complex and more human than that. For one small, real moment, the architecture dropped completely, and underneath it was a man who had spent years in a specific proximity to a specific loss. The cousin who had gone into the fire and come back different, who had closed himself away, who had become stone. And what was in his face in that moment was not only the cold fury of a scheme interrupted, but something older and more genuine and considerably more pathetic in the truest sense of that word. He had wanted the duchy, yes. He had planned for it. But she thought, looking at that brief, unguarded moment, that he had also, somewhere underneath the plan, been furious in the way that only the genuinely abandoned are furious. He had stayed. He had been the one who stayed, and the man he stayed for had never trusted him. Had been right not to trust him, which was the particular cruelty of it. And somewhere in the calculus of that long, bitter equation, the plan and the fury and the genuine wound had become indistinguishable from each other. This did not make him less dangerous. She held his gaze and thought, a wounded animal does not become safe because you understand why it's wounded. And then Reginald reached into his coat. The room was loud around them. Nobody was watching. Mrs. Pemberton was laughing 30 feet away. The orchestra had moved into a waltz. He produced an envelope. He set it on the side table to his left with the deliberate precision of a man placing a final card. "The letters," he said. "Lady Vivian, written in your hand." His eyes were on Cedric now, and the cold in them was operational and entirely intentional. Written to a Dr. Alastair Gove in Edinburgh. Intimate correspondence. Predating your marriage by 6 months, and significantly more recent than 6 months. He paused. Significantly more recent. The air in the immediate vicinity of the four of them changed. Vivian felt the room tilt. Not in herself, but in the space. In the sudden rushing drop of what was happening. She looked at the envelope. She looked at Reginald's face, at the cold precision of it, at the control, at the man who had decided that if the accounts weren't going to be enough, he would use something else, who had planned for contingency with the thoroughness of someone who did not accept single points of failure. She looked at Cedric. His face was contained, completely contained, every line of it locked down with the specific trained quality of a man who has spent years developing the ability to not react in public. And she watched him look at the envelope and look at Reginald and look at the envelope again. And she watched the calculation move through him, and she watched the moment when the calculation collided with the thing underneath the calculation. The wound, the structural one, the 11 years of it, the accumulated proof that trust collapsed. And she watched what it cost him to hold the shutter down. His eyes moved to her, gray, open, unmanaged. She looked back. The orchestra played. Somewhere in the room, someone laughed at something charming and completely irrelevant. She had written to Gove. 6 months ago, before the arrangement, 2 letters about her botanical portfolio. She had a 3rd letter she had drafted but not sent, and she knew, with a cold certainty, that Reginald had the draft, had found it in her father's house, in her desk, or through some other avenue she had not had the wit to anticipate. The draft was warm. The draft was the letter of a girl who had not yet been redirected north, who had been careful but not careful enough in her language with a man whose professional interest she had been trying to cultivate. The draft was not incriminating, but it could be made to look at, in the right room, with the right framing, presented by the right man. She watched Cedric's face, and she thought about calcification, about closing, about the long-practiced reflex of a man who had stopped building the thing that kept collapsing. She watched him stand at the exact interior edge of that reflex, balanced on it, aware of it, fighting it with the physical effort of someone fighting a tide, and she thought about what Reginald had said in the kitchen garden. He'll walk away. He always walks away. She had approximately 4 seconds. She reached out and took Cedric's hand. In public. In the ballroom. The physical, deliberate, entirely visible act of reaching out and taking the hand of her husband. Not grasping, not clinging, just her hand in his, direct and steady and completely unperformed. She felt him go still. The absolute stillness of a man who has been stopped mid-reflex by something he didn't expect. She looked at Reginald. "Show me," she said. He had not expected that. She watched him not expect it, watched the recalibration move through the composed face with the same fractional quality she had observed in the stable yard, the micro-adjustment of someone encountering a variable their model didn't account for. "Show me the letters," she said. Her voice was even, completely even. Cedric's hand was warm and still in hers, and she could feel his pulse through it, faster than usual, the body reporting what the face would not. "Put them on the table and show me what you have." Reginald looked at their joined hands, looked at her face, looked at Ashworth, who was watching with the careful, witness-quality attention of a man who understood that what was happening in front of him was the real business of the evening. He opened the envelope. He laid 3 sheets on the side table. Vivienne looked at them without releasing Cedric's hand, and she looked at them with the systematic attention of someone cataloging information rather than reacting to it, and she saw immediately what she had suspected. The 2 letters were genuine, recognizably her hand, warm but not inappropriate. The 3rd, the draft, had been altered. Specific words, specific phrases, inserted with a skill that was considerable, but not, under direct examination in proper light, invisible. She picked it up. She looked at the word that wasn't hers, a word in a sentence she had not written, in a paragraph that had been moved from context, the specific language of intimacy that she would not have used in correspondence with a professional contact she had met once at a lecture, and whose interest in her botanical work was entirely and exclusively professional. She set it down. She looked at Reginald. "This one's forged," she said. Silence in their immediate orbit. "You altered the draft," she said. "The original is in my desk at Blackthorn Manor. The ink on this word," she pointed without touching it again, "is a different grade. You can see it in this light if you look directly." Ashworth leaned forward and looked directly. Reginald's face was doing something she had not seen it do before, moving through options at speed, visible in the way that very composed people's faces are sometimes visible when the composure is operating at maximum capacity and the load exceeds it. He was calculating. He was recalculating. He was, she understood, for the first time in this entire months-long construction, encountering a situation for which he had not fully prepared because he had not believed it was possible. He had not believed she would fight back in the room. He had believed Cedric would walk away, and she would be standing alone when he did. And standing alone, she would have neither the steadiness nor the audience to make the accusation of forgery land. He had not prepared for her hand in Cedric's, for the steadiness, for the light in the room falling exactly where it fell. Cedric's fingers tightened around hers. Once. Deliberate. Reginald looked at him across the side table and the three letters and the accumulated wreckage of years of construction, and what moved through his face in that moment was complex enough to be almost sympathetic and dangerous enough to make her grip tighten in return. Because Reginald Blackthorne was not, she understood in this moment, a man who accepted the end of things. He was a man who, cornered, found another door. She watched his eyes move past her shoulder, toward the edge of the room, toward someone she couldn't see without turning. Cedric saw it too. She felt it in the change of his hand, a different quality of stillness. "Who else did you bring?" Cedric said. Reginald smiled, and for the first time it did not reach his eyes, and what was behind the eyes was something that had shed all pretense of warmth and was simply, cleanly, what it had always been. "Did you think," Reginald said quietly, "that the letters were the whole of it?" The orchestra played. Cedric turned, and Vivienne turned. And across the room, moving through the assembled guests of the Ashworth Winter Ball with the careful, deliberate progress of someone who had been waiting for exactly this moment, was a man she did not recognize. Older, official in bearing, carrying himself with the specific authority of someone who was not a social guest. A man who was looking directly at Cedric. A man who had papers in his hand. And behind him, visible in the entrance to the ballroom, two others. Reginald had not come with letters. He had come with the law. The man with the papers was named Whitmore, and he was a court-appointed examiner from the Chancery Division, and he had traveled from London in 3 days, which meant Reginald had set him in motion before the ball, before the letters, before any of it, had set him in motion as the final instrument, the one that required no performance, no witnesses deciding who to believe, because the law did not require belief. It required documentation, and Reginald had spent 3 years manufacturing exactly that. Vivienne felt Cedric's hand go from warm to stone, not in temperature. In quality, the change that moved through him was not physical withdrawal, but the interior version of it. The calcification she had been warned about, the thing she had watched him fight at the edge of in the ballroom 2 minutes ago. She felt it happen in the hand she was holding, and she gripped harder, which was not romantic and was not gentle, and was, she thought, probably the most important thing she had done in her 19 years. She held on. He did not pull away, but he also did not turn to look at her. Whitmore reached them. He was a deliberate man, the kind whose face had been trained by decades of arriving in rooms where people did not want him to arrive, and he carried the papers with the specific neutrality of someone who understood that he was an instrument and not an agent. "Your Grace," he said, "I am required to present these formally. A petition for estate management review has been filed in Chancery under the provisions of the 1847 Estates Act. You will have 14 days to respond through legal counsel." The ballroom continued around them. Vivienne was aware of it the way you are aware of weather you are not standing in, distantly, as context, as the background against which the immediate and the real were occurring. She was aware that people nearby had begun to sense that something was happening at the edge of the room. She was aware of Ashworth standing very still to her left, reading the situation with the eyes of a man who had just understood the full geometry of what he had been invited into. Cedric took the papers with his free hand. The hand she was holding did not move. He looked at the document with the gray eyes giving nothing at all, and she watched him read it, and she watched him understand what Reginald had built. The full architecture of it, laid out in legal language. The 3 years of manufactured discrepancy formatted into formal allegation. The witnesses Reginald had cultivated in the Northern Landowners Association, named in the supporting documentation, her own arrival at the manor framed in the cold, clinical language of irregular consent. He read it completely. He was thorough. He had always been thorough. Then he folded it. He looked at Reginald. The look lasted approximately 4 seconds, and it was the most complete absence of performance she had ever seen on a human face. No anger, No grief, no betrayal in the theatrical sense. Just seeing. A man looking at another man and seeing him completely, without the filter of what he had wanted him to be, without the distortion of the boy who had come to the estate in summers. Just what was there. Just what had been there, underneath the warmth and the letters and the 11 years of the only family who stayed. Reginald held the look. To his credit, he held it. He did not look away. "Why?" Cedric said. One word. Flat. Not rhetorical. Reginald was quiet for a moment. Around them, the orchestra had concluded a set, and in the pause between pieces, the relative silence was sharper. Several guests had drifted close with the unerring instinct of people drawn to the charge in a room without knowing its source. "You know why," Reginald said. "Tell me anyway." Something moved through Reginald's face. The last layer of the assembly, the final performance, gave way to something that was genuine and complicated and too late. "Because you were going to leave it all to rot," he said. "You were going to sit in that house and turn to stone until there was nothing left of the dukedom, and I was going to watch it happen, and no one—" He stopped. Started differently, with the quality of someone who has rehearsed a speech and discovered in the delivery that it means something other than they thought. "I built something," he said. "A plan for the land, for the tenants, things you never bothered to—" "The Eastern Field tenants," Cedric said, "have had their rents reduced twice in the last 4 years. The drainage project will prevent the flooding that has cost them crops for 6 consecutive seasons. The plans are documented and in progress." His voice was completely level. "You have been managing those accounts for 3 years, and you have not been to the Eastern Fields in 2. The silence after this was different from every other silence in the evening. It had the specific quality of a structure collapsing not with violence, but with the slow, inevitable surrender of something that was never as solid as it appeared. Reginald looked at Cedric, and Vivian watched the calculation in his face reach its end, reach the point where there was nothing further to calculate, and what was left underneath was not the cold strategist and not the assembled charming cousin, but something closer to a man standing in the wreckage of what he had built and understanding, possibly for the first time, the full dimensions of what it had cost. He looked at their joined hands. He looked away. Ashworth stepped forward. "Mr. Whitmore," he said, in the tone of a man exercising a regional authority that was older and more fundamental than any chancery petition. "I wonder if you might step into my study and review some documentation that has come to my attention regarding this matter. Documentation that predates this petition by 8 days and which I believe is materially relevant to the Chancery's evaluation." He paused. "I believe you are required under the Act's provisions to consider contradicting evidence before the petition advances." Whitmore looked at him, looked at the papers in Cedric's hand, made the calculation of a man who understood which way a situation had already moved. "I am so required," he said. Ashworth gestured toward the corridor. Whitmore went. Reginald watched him go, skulls. What happened next had the quality of a structure that has been under extraordinary pressure for a very long time, finally, slowly, yielding, not dramatically. The orchestra began a new set. The guests who had drifted close drifted back to their conversations, sensing that whatever had almost happened had resolved in a way that did not require them. The ballroom resumed its performance of itself. Reginald stood at the side table with the 3 letters still spread on its surface and the envelope open beside them, and he looked at the letters the way a person looks at the physical evidence of a decision they cannot take back. And then he looked at Cedric. "I'm not going to apologize," he said. "I'm not going to pretend I'm sorry." "I know," Cedric said, "but I—" He stopped. The thing in his face was real. She was certain of it. It was not performance, not strategy, not the assembled warmth deployed for effect. It was a man at the edge of something he had been moving away from for years and had just been forced to stop. "I was there," he said, "at the fire. I stood outside. You know what I've carried for that." "I know," Cedric said again, and something shifted in the flat voice. Not warmth, not forgiveness, not yet, but the slightest alteration in register that was the first possibility of it. The way a door that has been sealed for a long time moves fractionally in wind, not opening, but acknowledging the existence of a hinge. "The guilt did not give you the right," Vivian said. Reginald looked at her, not with anger, with the frank, exhausted attention of a man who had run out of angles. "No," he said. "It didn't." He picked up the letters from the side table. He picked up the envelope. He looked at them for a moment with the expression of a man holding something he built with considerable care and skill and watching it be nothing. Then he turned and walked toward the door of the ballroom, moving through the assembled guests with the same ease he had arrived with, because Reginald Blackthorne was, above all other things, a man who knew how to leave a room. At the door he paused, did not turn. "The tenants in the eastern field," he said, to no one specific, to the middle distance. "The Hartley family, near the north boundary. The eldest boy is bright. He should be sent to school." Then he was gone. The door closed behind him. Vivienne stood in this ballroom with Cedric's hand in hers, and the orchestra playing something slow and northern and old, and she thought about what it cost a person to build a cage for themselves and call it a plan. She thought about Reginald standing outside the fire at 20 years old, watching the smoke, carrying that specific weight for years until the weight became the justification for what he built with it. She thought about how guilt, carried long enough and not tended, became something else. Not the productive guilt that changes behavior, but the calcified guilt that demands compensation, that says, "I could not save you, so I am owed something in return." She did not forgive him. Forgiveness was not hers to extend or withhold on Cedric's behalf, and for herself, she had not been harmed in the ways that required it. But she understood him, which was a different thing and in its own way more useful, because understanding the mechanism of a thing meant you could see it coming, the next time, in a different shape. She turned to Cedric. He was looking at the door Reginald had gone through. His face had the stripped quality, the underneath, the unmanaged reality of it. And this time she did not look away and did not give him the space to reassemble. She looked at him and let him be seen. After a long moment he looked back at her. "The Hartley boy," he said. "I heard," she said. "He's 9 years old. I've been aware of him for 2 years." His jaw moved. Reginald never mentioned him before tonight. She held his gaze. He knew. "He knew," Cedric said. And in those 2 words was the entirety of what the evening had cost. The recognition that underneath the scheme, underneath the patient, calculated betrayal, there had been a person who knew the specific human details of the estate, who had paid attention, who had cared in the way that people care when they have not yet converted caring into leverage. The recognition that the boy who had come in summers and the man who had come with a chancery petition were the same person, and the knowledge of that was not simple and would not become simple, and would need to be lived with in the way that all complicated true things needed to be lived with. Vivienne released his hand, not withdrawal. She released it deliberately, with the intention of a person who had been holding a thing steady through a storm and was choosing, now that the storm had passed, to let it find its own footing. He looked at his own hand for a moment. "I'd like to go home," he said. "Yes," she said. "Let's go home." They left the Ashworth ball at 11, which was earlier than was socially conventional, and neither of them mentioned it. The carriage ride north was long and cold, and they sat across from each other in the dark, the way they had been sitting across from each other for 9 weeks. Not the arranged marriage distance of the first days, not the careful professional proximity of the weeks that followed, but the particular closeness of 2 people who had been through something together and were still in the process of understanding what together meant. Vivienne watched the dark countryside move past the window, and she thought about the evening, and she thought about the morning that would follow it, and all the mornings after that, and she felt something settle in her that had been unsettled since the carriage ride north 9 weeks ago. Not the grand settling of a problem solved, not the relief of a crisis survived, but the quieter, deeper settling of a person who has found, in a place they didn't expect to find anything, the thing they were going to build their life around. She did not say any of this. She said, "The Hartley boy. What's his name?" Cedric, across from her in the dark. "James. We should send someone to see the family this week." "I had already planned to." She looked at him. "When?" "Before tonight," he said. "The Eastern Field Survey. I've been planning to visit the North Boundary families before the winter fully sets in." He paused. "I mentioned it to Graves last week." She held this. "You don't tell me things," she said. "Not accusation. Observation, the kind that contains its own question. He was quiet for long enough that the carriage covered considerable ground. "It's a habit," he said finally. "A long one." "I know. He stopped. The stopping had a different quality from the old ones. Not the careful editing of a man managing disclosure, but the genuine difficulty of someone reaching for language and territory they have not previously navigated. "I am aware that it's a habit that it has a cost." Another stop. "To you." She looked at him across the dark interior of the carriage, the man she had been married to for 9 weeks. The man who put flowers on a dressing table and treated lame horses himself and talked about drainage for 11 minutes and held her hand in a ballroom in front of witnesses without being asked, because something in him had chosen, in the 4 seconds available, to choose differently from the reflex. "It does," she said, "have a cost." "I know, but it's not." She chose her words carefully. "It's not the kind of thing that can't change. It's a habit, like you said. Not a character. You're not incapable of it. You just haven't—" She stopped. "You haven't had anyone to tell things to, for a very long time." He looked at her. "No," he said, "I haven't." The carriage moved through the dark. The north pressed against the glass with its old, indifferent cold. "Cedric," she said. "Yes." "The fire," she said. "Tell me what actually happened. Not what people say. Not what Reginald told me." She held his gaze across the dark. "Tell me." The silence that followed was the longest of all of them. Longer than the stable yard, longer than the library at 2 a.m, longer than the ballroom. It was the silence of a man standing at a door he has not opened in 11 years and deciding, finally, whether the person on the other side is worth the opening. He told her. It took most of the remaining journey north. He told it in the flat, economical way he told everything, without performance, without the romantic mythology that the story had acquired in other people's tellings. Not a hero running into fire, not a noble sacrifice, but a 25-year-old man on his way back from Hexham who saw the smoke and stopped the carriage because the smoke was wrong, because the smoke was the color and volume of something that had found a structure to eat rather than contained burning. And the village was a quarter-mile off the road, and he went because the alternative was not going. He went 3 times. He told her what he saw inside and what he heard and what it felt like when the roof section came down the second time, and he told her without the armor of retrospective meaning, not I did the right thing, not I would do it again, just the account of a man who had been in a burning building and carried the record of it on his face and in his sleep, and in the specific way he woke at night sometimes in the library with the glass on the floor, and had carried it alone for 11 years because there had been no one to set it down with. By the time he finished, the carriage had slowed, the gates of Blackthorn Manor visible ahead. She did not say anything for a moment. Then she said, "Catherine Fallow was a coward." Something in his face moved. Surprised. The fractional surprise of a man who has been carrying a wound for so long he has stopped examining it, and finds, when someone else names it plainly, that it is not the shape he thought it was. "She was 23, he said, without quite defending her. "Yes," Vivian said. "And a coward." The carriage passed through the gates. He looked at her with the gray eyes in the dark, and she saw, for the first time without any obscuring layer, the full face of what it had been. 11 years of it, the fire and the face and the woman who left, and the cousin who stayed and turned out to be building something in the leaving of everyone else, and the estate and the accounts and the drainage projects and the lame horse and the flowers on the dressing table, and all of it, accumulating in a single human being who had decided, at some point, that the most reasonable response to a world that kept collapsing was to stop building anything that could. She thought about what it meant to choose differently. Not the grand gesture, not the ballroom, not the petition, not the dramatic machinery of the evening they'd just survived. The small choosing, the flowers, the 11 minutes, the "I will not ask more than you are willing to give freely" said in the flat voice of a man who meant it because he understood, specifically and from experience, the weight of having more asked of you than you had to give. He had been doing it the whole time, she realized, making small, specific choices toward her, in the way of someone who had forgotten how to move toward people and was relearning it the way you relearn something your body once knew, tentatively, with the attention of someone who cannot yet trust the muscle memory. The carriage stopped. They stood in the entrance hall of Blackthorn Manor, coats still on, the fire in the grate already laid for their return, Mrs. Pelham's doing, the domestic care of a woman who had kept this house for a very long time and understood that home was something maintained rather than given. The hall was warm. The house was quiet. Outside, the Northumberland dark did what it had always done. Vivienne looked around the entrance hall. The iron fixtures, the stone floor, the staircase rising to the rooms she had been mapping for 9 weeks. And she felt the settling again, the quiet kind, the kind that didn't announce itself. She looked at Cedric. He was looking at her with the unmanaged face and the gray eyes, and he was, she thought, in the process of doing the thing she had watched him learn to do over the past 9 weeks, standing in an open space without immediately reconstructing the walls. "James Hartley," she said. His mouth moved. "Thursday," he said. "I'll go Thursday." "We'll go Thursday," she said. He was quiet. "Yes," he said. "We'll go Thursday." She pulled off her gloves. She set them on the entrance table beside the silver tray that had carried Reginald's first letter and all the mornings since. She looked at the tray and thought about all the things that arrived in houses, about letters, people, plans, grief, the slow accumulation of evidence about who a person actually was underneath what the world had decided to call them. "The garden," she said. "The east wall. There's a hawthorn structure that I want to draw properly in spring, when it comes back. I want to do it in full botanical detail." "All right," he said. "I'll need to correspond with Gove about the technique." She looked at him directly. "The correspondence will be professional, and I will show it to you whenever you want." He held her gaze. "You don't—" "I know I don't have to," she said. "I want to. Because transparency is the only architecture that doesn't collapse." She paused. "Someone told me that pretense wastes time." The corner of his mouth moved. The real version, the full version, not the sketch, not the possibility, but the thing itself. Brief, genuine, altering his entire face with the sudden and startling effect of light entering a room that has been dark for a very long time.